It's funny looking back at this episode now for oh so many reasons. Chiefly, I'll admit, the 7 years we got that followed and all the ups and downs, mostly downs, that have caused many a vein in my head to bulge over the years, but also the context of the time in which it was made. New Who was being reinvented for the first time, the cosy familiarity of the RTD years were behind us, and it was a brave new Moffat world, where we'd see this bold reinvention, and yes, I can't even bother to finish this particularly one, obviously that's not what really happened. Perhaps the biggest flaw of this episode is that it would not have seen much place out of place in the RTD era, only now had worse jokes and marginally more explosions. To me, it's a bit of a restatement of what New Who is and why it was very comfortable being and not much else, which is probably why this is a popular episode among those who like New Who, and why it's not so much of a popular episode among me. As I said though, it's also the start of an era that I never really bothers to try and fix any of the issues that are immediately apparent here. We say focus on spectacle, weak character and weak comedy throughout pretty much the whole of the 7 years. Indeed, it's frankly kind of sad I can point to some of the exact issues in this episode rearing their head in Twice Upon a Time, which shows nothing was ever learnt at any point. I'm therefore stuck between a bit of a rock and a hard place here. I can't really see this episode as some bold new change, because it's not, nor as a start to a new era where the kinks will be ironed out and promise delivered on, because it's also not. It is, in the sense of its place in Doctor Who's history, rather exactly what it says on the tin. And as for it as an actual episode of Doctor Who, well, I've seen worse, which with New Who is not always a given, and I think it succeeds at some of what it sets out to do. Introduce a new Doctor, new status quo, manage to hit some of its story bits it wants to, and it does have its moments where it does well. It just doesn't really manage to come together as a coherent whole for me. If we quickly examine those two perspectives I talked about though, firstly, even though 15 years have passed, oh my god, 15 years have passed. Anyway, even though it's been that long, I still remember exactly how I felt after watching this episode on the initial broadcast. Disappointment. Admittedly, the reasons would have been very different between when I was 12 years old and now, but the broad idea that I was hoping for a clean break with what came before, taking the show in a new direction, and said hopes would dash pretty comprehensively with this episode. The alien invading contemporary Earth threat, the familiar home unit for the companion, the rush hectic pace, the Doctor having a zany, frantic personality, there's little to me then or now that wouldn't have seemed out of place under RTD, and indeed these are mostly tropes that have stayed firmly in place across New Who. It kind of tells the viewer watching it, and in order no risks will be taken, and indeed this episode doesn't really take any risks. And well, as I said, I'd be maybe more forgiving of it if I felt it was growing pains, and if the issues were fixed going forward, I'd appreciate if nothing is going to be perfect on a first try. The problem is that didn't happen. The weak plots, underdeveloped characters, total reliance on spectacle and cool imagery rather than building strong stories, and the terrible comedy became staples of the era, and those issues rarely got any better than they are here. As I said, Twice Upon a Time, last episode of the era, has pretty much most of these exact same problems. I will try not to use this episode as a punching bag for all my problems with the Moffat era as a whole. I'll try and take it as what it is, but being as it is, effectively an avatar for its era, it's inevitably going to happen. So with all of that in mind, we'll start on the episode proper. Firstly with its production as usual, and this brings us to the director, Adam Smith. He directed this episode and then the first crappy Angel sequel a few stories later, which we've already covered. I want to like the directing job he does here, but unfortunately I want to like it a lot more than I actually do. There's a lot he does right. The strength of the episode is that it's fast-paced and energetic. For all the crap in the script, you're never allowed to get bored, at least until the very end, but never mind. And I think Smith deserves a lot of credit for keeping that energy throughout the episode, and he does this with some engaging and interesting camera work and editing. Unfortunately though, interesting is also a phrase that can be applied to much of it in a different way, in that it can be ridiculously over the top. Dynamic and goofy is a fine line to tread, admittedly, but he less steps over it and more trips and faceplants over it at points. The most glaring moment for me, but the one I'll use as the example, was one I just kind of straight up laughed at. It's a scene on the village green where the camera suddenly zooms around all the people there until it finds the villain. A moment that completely takes you out of the episode and looks ridiculous and frankly cheap while doing it. It's very Sherlocky, for lack of a better word, and it's something that has aged about as well as Sherlock itself has, i.e. not very. There are also other bizarre moments, most obviously the use of lens flares once or twice, because obviously we needed a homage to J.J. Abrams' Star Trek in this. Smith's background is actually the director of music videos, which makes sense why he'd be able to handle the fast pace very well and keep things energetic and exciting, but probably goes overboard with what something like Doctor Who actually calls for. I think he deserves a lot of credit for making the piece work overall when it easily could have become a complete nightmare pacing-wise, but the possibility was without a doubt on the page there, but, you know... yeah. I'll give Smith one other thing. He manages to keep this as having a strong feeling of having a large scope and scale, where if you think about it, it actually doesn't really. This is honestly, actually kind of a cheap episode. Apart from the CGI, which is hardly extensive by New Who standards, and a few pyrotechnics, there's very little. Few generic sets and location shoots, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Sometimes it's good to save money on stuff like this. I'm just pointing it out. I think this episode probably didn't cost very much to make, and choosing this as the bottle episode was a bold, but ultimately I don't think bad choice. I commend Smith for managing to put together an episode that never fails in its ambition to be a bold and large opening story for its era while doing so with said resources, and the rest of the production team for doing very well while finding these elements to work with. And I suppose Moffat for writing a script that could have been done this way on the cheap. Ugh, I feel dirty. Speaking of the CGI, well, you probably don't need me to tell you I don't think it's very good, and while it isn't, I think the issues with it in this episode are indicative of two issues with the approach New Who took to it in general. I mean, yeah, in 2010 you were not going to get great effects with a budget of a BBC drama, and the advances made over the last 15 years that Doctor Who, under the most recent regime, has been able to have much better effects. Shame about everything else. But the fact it's been able to do that just shows how far things have changed. But, part of making anything creative is understanding your limitations and trying to avoid having to push past them in a way so that you avoid something looking ridiculous. Well, at least I like to think so, but New Who is very happy in proving me wrong on that. Issue 1 is knowing when less is more. Now, this is very much an issue with the script, probably more so than the production, and we'll get to it. But we absolutely did not need to see the silly giant worm version of Prisoner Zero, and the fact it ends up looking ridiculous whenever it does appear was an entirely avoidable situation. Admittedly, its initial appearance where it jankily moves around Amy as Karen Gillan tries to get the hang of acting in front of a tennis ball with white dots on it is pretty embarrassing on its own and sets the tone pretty quickly, but there was absolutely no need to see this thing at all. It has nothing to the story, in fact it subtracts from it, quite a lot actually, as it completely robs Prisoner Zero of any of its mystery. Now, as I said, that's a script issue that we will get to, but I think it's very indicative of New Who's approach that any kind of subtler, lower-key option wasn't really on the table. Perhaps a quick glimpse in the corner of our eyes, we focus on the characters in the scene. In any case, what should have been a major strength for the story is ruined because we know our main villain is this goofy ass-looking worm. Issue 2 is knowing when not to chase striking or cool images to the exclusion of, well, common sense. If you'd asked anyone whether a giant eye would be something that would look cool or ridiculous, and I think most people would probably say that even on a much higher budget than Doctor Who, it'd be very difficult to pull off such a concept without it looking goofy. And guess what? It looks goofy and ridiculous, and any power or menace he attracts he might have had, given they're about to vaporise the world and all that, completely vanished because of how silly this thing looks. And I know exactly how we got to this point. Moffat had the grand idea in his head of this giant eye. Because that would be a striking and cool, in quotation marks, image, it had to be done no matter how much of a detriment it would be to the actual story. The eye would be memorable, even though a slightly less memorable or cool thing might have actually looked vaguely threatening, and not like the kind of monster you'd see in a really silly and forgettable episode of Star Trek the original series. Those are two pitfalls to avoid, and this episode didn't, and it's to its detriment. It's a shame because the ideas behind these things are quite good, but even leaving how they were set up poorly on the script aside, the realization on the screen is weak and leaves the experience lacking. Which therefore brings us to the script, and look, as much as I lampoon him, I don't think Stephen Moffat is a bad writer. He's obviously written no shortage of great stuff over the years. I think he's pretty conclusively proven he's not that, but he is a frustrating writer because he never seems to learn from his mistakes, and it becomes extremely annoying for me as the viewer and the reviewer to have to see the same shit over and over again when I find it so irritating. And while I'm not presumed to see inside his mind, I can only presume that it is good old-fashioned stubbornness. And while that basically all of the issues I have with this episode became long-running runs throughout his era, that should tell you all you need to know there. And yet, perhaps, I am too harsh on him. Because one of the criticisms I had of this episode just feels too much like continuity from the RTD era, so perhaps these are just endemic issues with New Who as a whole. Moffat was maybe just playing with the box he had. And yet, maybe not, because so many aspects of it just have his fingerprints all over it. I suppose that's the question, really, you never quite know the answer. There are good things about this episode. As an introduction to the 11th Doctor, it works pretty well. It's not all great, as we'll get to, but the overall idea does work. This is the Doctor going through his post-regenerative fuzz, of course, but also working out who he is, and I think it's portrayed really well. The 11th Doctor has actually got over the post-regeneration stuff much quicker than most of his predecessors, and is keeping up the appearance in order to, well, that's for the audience to work out. Whether he's doing it to lull his enemies, to make the effective use of the situation, or just for his own amusement, who knows? I like that there are questions here. I also like that while the jokey and playful exterior is maintained, it's always clear under the surface what's really going on, and despite much of the silliness that this is in fact a darker and more serious incarnation than we had previously. Again, it's very well put forward with its subtleties. We sort of get the Tennant-like jokey figure that the bosses wanted because they were shit scared of doing anything different, but the fact that there is more subtlety and depth to it means that the show is here having its cake and eating it too. And of course, much of the credit goes to Matt Smith, who finds the role quickly. He's not quite there, and he never ended up comfortable with the weak comedy even once he settled into the role, But he does give a brilliant performance in this, with a playful exterior and powerful confident subtleties all done very well. The Troughton influence is obvious, but it's not just a copy of Troughton's performance. It's a different interpretation of the same idea, and Smith is excellent in putting his own spin on it. This leads us to what is my pick for the best scene of the episode. After Prisoner Zero has been captured, the Doctor calls the Atraxi back to Earth to give them a bit of a ticking off. It's a simple idea and one that requires little explanation, to call them back and intimidate them enough to make sure they piss off for good, but one that informs so much about this Doctor's character immediately. Now, it is hurt by the decision to intermix it with a shit joke or two, Kelsa Breeze, but once those bits are out the way, we see the Doctor stroll confidently onto the roof and with only a few sentences, make the Atraxi basically shit themselves and fuck off. It really is an absolutely fantastic scene. It makes the Doctor seem powerful with just a few words. He doesn't need anything more than that, and I think it really does sell that this new Doctor, is the real deal, despite the, well, all the silliness and stuff. Smith is absolutely brilliant delivering his lines without any surface menace, but we understand how deadly serious he is from the subtleties in his performance. He doesn't need to go all dark or deeply voiced or anything silly like that. We understand all we need to know. This Doctor might be at times a little goofy, and even in the moment he's fucking about with his tie, but when it comes down to it, he's as capable and powerful as the Doctor ever is. This scene also makes a very wise and effective use of the images of the previous Doctors to build up to this new one, which contrasts with how I've been using every other fucking episode during RTD2, but I digress. It's also a great scene on the production side, especially with the music that builds up to a very effective climax. I Am the Doctor might have been hilariously overused throughout this era, but there's no denying when it's used well, it works. There are other things about the episode that I think do work. The pacing is actually not bad. It's breakneck quick, of course, probably a little too fast for my tastes, but as I said in the directing bit, it works well in keeping things energetic and exciting. I'd say this works very well in the middle part of the episode, not so much as the bookends. The first 15-20 and last 10 minutes slow right down, which works and doesn't work. It's more effective what it's trying to do in those moments, but also makes it feel a little uneven, especially the last 10 minutes, which is the only time the episode gets a bit dull as we see the new TARDIS and Amy and the Doctor go through the new Doctor and companion stuff. It's all a bit generic, really, but make no mistake, throughout the meat of the episode, the bits that actually matter, the pace works well enough to prevent that. Even though most of the nonsense in the scripts, you'll still be entertained by its energy. I'll compare it to the other Moffat era first episode for A New Doctor, Deep Breath, which I've already reviewed, which suffered from poor pacing and in particular poor tone management, which led to huge awkward tonal shifts which hurt the episode a great deal. This episode avoids that. It keeps the same brisk energy throughout and makes sure that even the bad jokes and the drama stay within the same style and the kind of story they were trying to tell. It means this episode doesn't suffer from those same issues at all. It's actually one of the few Moffat era cliches it avoids, and it's tonally quite successful. But as I said, so much of it comes down to a brilliantly energetic pace. It actually does work really well, and it marries all these different elements into a pretty coherent whole in that regard. I also, in common with a lot of Who you might have noticed, like the ideas a hell of a lot more than I like their execution. The idea of Prisoner Zero is absolutely fantastic, this nebulous, formless shapeshifter who possesses other bodies but can't quite use them right. It's a brilliant idea to have a really effective and menacing villain, able to blend in enough that they could just be another person in the room, but uncanny enough that it would have set off the creepiness meter. The idea of it escaping a prison is also really interesting, had it been developed, but it wasn't. Never mind. Some of the ideas behind Amy's story were also interesting, but it wasn't. Never mind. Oh no, do mind, because it's time to look at those ideas and why they don't work. I'll start by looking at Amy's character here, because, as I just said, I do like the idea. The Doctor accidentally creates a huge impression on her as a child. She grows up with her own mixed feelings about this and him in general, and this influences how she reacts when she is properly thrust into his adventures. As an idea, great. It's something new in lieu of having a companion not from contemporary Earth, which seems like it's basically never going to happen even if New Who does ever return. It is about as unique a way of doing things as you can. The only other alternative is the most important person in the universe stuff, which seems to be the default and is just there, but we'll get to that another time. Anyway, in theory, the right character bits are hit here. Excitement as a child, disappointment and resentment initially as an adult, skepticism turning into acceptance and eventually excitement, while never quite losing that initial sense of betrayal that might lead to interesting beats in the future. In theory, that's where we are. But the theory does not translate to the screen, and it leaves the Amy just feeling very generic, and like the ideas behind a character are just not being explored. Now, this isn't really a problem with the scenes of her as a child. Here the character beats need to be simple, and they are, and the child actress is capable enough. But when the Gillan Amy appears, it just seems to lose its way. We never quite get the sense that her time with the Doctor is really affecting her as it should. The whole thing of her pretending to be a police officer feels completely pointless. I get wanting her to have her identity revealed a bit later on rather than just immediately, but it seems like it's there for no reason, which also applies to reveal that her job is a kissogram. whatever the fuck a kissogram is. 15 years later and I'm still scratching my head at that. My guess is a replacement for other jobs that Moffat couldn't name in a family-friendly program, which is, frankly, not something I feel should be anywhere near said family-friendly program at all, but I digress. It just feels pointless. What comes out of her pretending to be a police officer? Nothing. She acts as basically anyone would throughout most of these scenes, and it never really comes up again. And what comes out of her being a kissogram? Oh, Moffat. Anyway, what comes out of that? Nothing. It has zero bearing on anything that happens. Not nilch nada. Meanwhile, the things I actually want to know, how she felt about being abandoned by the Doctor, how she feels about finding him again, taking in that her raggedy Doctor is real, that's just given lip service. She's cross about him disappearing, but it gets resolved after like one short conversation as she traps his tie in a car. You could just take the tie off, Doctor. But anyway, he says a few generic words, and then she's pretty happy with it again, and her years of resentment and disappointment basically go unmentioned. She in fact seems remarkably unfazed about the whole time, about finding out in the course of about an hour, if we're going to be generous, that her childhood imaginary friend is not only real, but is also fighting aliens. I give it, if I remember right, a plot point later in the series is that the crack in time is erasing her memories of alien invasions from the RTD era. You can't use the argument that she's already familiar with them. There's no depth to it at all. I just don't get the idea of how Amy feels about any of this, or how this is shaping her, or indeed who she is as a person, and how her experience with the Doctor shaped that. I get the feeling that from this that she's generic, just basically a companion archetype, only she gets a bit moody when the Doctor abandons her for a few years, which is fair enough, I guess, and also whenever Rory opens his mouth, which, yeah, that's a happy marriage incoming. The point is, I just feel like her character arc is non-existent. We don't get the idea she's changed or evolved, and I don't know, maybe the time jump doesn't help this, but there's no feeling like we see her go through a character journey in this episode, or, well, to be frank, her time as a show as a whole, except she eventually stops being such an ass to Rory. In theory. The opening 15 minutes or so with a young Amy are another kettle of fish entirely. Once again, the idea is sound for the reasons I mentioned before, but here there's so much dead air burnt on, you guessed it, bad Moffat comedy. Why I had to waste my time watching the hilarious comedy about the Doctor eating food is beyond me, but rest assured the corners of my mouth never were once slightly raised. I don't get what the joke is, and frankly I don't even care to guess, but I suspect this was an attempt for Moffat to try and be funny, try being the operative word, but also so he could set up his stupid fish fingers and custard shit, for he knew exactly what he was doing in turning into some artificial meme to be used on Tumblr posts, because obviously we need crap like that to go with quotation marks and all that shit as they used to do back in those days, and not, actual story and characters. Don't be absurd. Speaking of bad comedy, there are a few other characters in this. There's Rory, who doesn't have much to do and is a bit of a cutout here, but I guess I'll excuse that on the basis there were obviously future plans for the character and they just sort of need to establish he existed. But other than that, there are basically no supporting characters. Other than Jeff, of course. Yep, Jeff. Who exists for two reasons. Firstly, so we can talk to the leaders of the world in the bizarre Patrick Moore cameo, and he's the one doing it because... and it means... And his character is... Oh, what's the use? He's absolutely nothing character, as you've guessed, and his inclusion here just means nothing. It doesn't add anything to the Doctor's character either, before you say. Secondly, he's here so he can be the genesis of Moffat's favourite kind of terrible comedy, porn jokes. Yes, here we get the jokes about his faction watching porn when the Doctor takes his laptop, and then the first ever browser history joke. The joke here is that he's watching porn, and that's it. You see why I hate Moffat's comedy so much? There's no actual joke to it, nothing clever to say, and doesn't make up for that by being actually funny. As I said many times at the start, this was the start of a trend of 7 years of unfunny jokes, and well, it's nice to know that we start as we mean to go on. Well, except it's not nice to know that, but never mind. I said the Doctor's arc works overall, and I do stand by that, but there are a few issues in the details, mostly because Amy's arc doesn't work. He doesn't really have anything to balance off. There's no reaction to her reactions or anything like that. So much of it, well, anything that involves interacting with her, just feels pretty generic, and it means the progression of his arc is stuck entirely with a defeat the villain plot. Which is fine, it was by design a bit lightweight, but that only would have been fine if the character work was good enough to fill the hole, but as it is, it isn't. I mean, it feels a bit incomplete, like we're almost there, but not quite. It's annoying because so much of his arc is successful, and I guess it does the underlying problem with the episode, of course, that it seems far more interested in the spectacle and explosions, both making it feel like a continuation from the RTD era, which was no stranger to these aspects, but also making it look like a frustrating start to an era that never really shied away from this as its grounding principle. It's frustrating we have time for the stupid food jokes with the giant eye, but not to actually develop our character arcs, and, well, welcome to the Moffat era, I suppose. Then there's the plot and villains. I said I liked the idea of Prisoner Zero, but the execution... it doesn't work. Issue 1 is, as I said back when I was talking about the effects, showing its true form as a silly looking giant worm was a huge mistake. It completely robs the mystery and menace from it. It goes from being this menacing nebulous shapeshifter that could be anyone, whose true nature and form is a mystery for the audience to only guess at, to being a silly CGI worm and nothing more, and unfortunately one is inclined to take it about that seriously throughout the rest of the episode, even when it does try to be Olivia Colman in the wasted part. I love the idea of it, a villain that's so truly alien and different, but the execution, it just doesn't live up to the potential, and it becomes another generic Who villain, and unfortunately is another point of comparison with the RTD era and how the Moffat era evolved. Wasted potential, where have I heard that one before? Oh yes, throughout pretty much the whole of New Who. Anyway, there are other issues. I feel like Prisoner Zero is used too much as a vehicle for exposition about the series-long plot, which, yeah, I know, you want to set up a bit here, but on the other hand, at the point of confrontation between the Doctor and the main villain of the episode, I'd hope for a bit more than just him explaining how things will go in future episodes. Much of what I said doesn't work about the villain, there's also stuff that doesn't work about the overall plot. Said overall plot, well, it's pretty light, as I said earlier, by design, and that's fine when you have other things you want to introduce, and I'm actually okay with it overall, because the pacing means it moves quickly enough that you gloss over most of its flaws. The problems come from a lack of development. I don't get a sense about the villain, for instance. There's no real attempt to answer the W questions. How, why, what. How is he doing half the stuff he's doing? Why is he taking over the form of the coma patients? And why are the coma patients being affected in that way? How long has he been doing it for? What's his endgame here? Is he trying to escape or just sadistically fuck around or what? And most importantly, what's his motivations? Does he have a backstory which gives his actions credence, or is he just a sadistic fucker? Was his imprisonment by the Atraxi just or not? None of these are answered, and I think giving your villain some depth will be a better use of time than food jokes, but I digress. Ever notice how I digress a lot in these reviews? Anyway, as for the rest of the plot, well, I'm torn, because having it light is fine if the character work is there to fill in the gaps, and I can't say it's a bad plan. It's just step 1 was the only one completed there, and to fill in the rest of the episode stuff, it just wasn't really done well. There's a bunch of other stuff in the episode that annoys me: the crappy theme and title sequence, the boring and uninspired new TARDIS interior, and the need to shoehorn in the setup of a series-wide arc that doesn't feel natural or well integrated at all. To name but a few, but to preserve my sanity, let's sort of call this here. In the end, it is difficult to hate this episode too much. For all it lacks in the detail, the brisk pace works in keeping it engaging, and at the points it does tell an effective mystery, and certainly we get the feeling of this new Doctor and what he's about to do very well, but there is no question there. And that seems to be all it really needs to do in theory. I suppose it does its job, but I guess I'm struck by 3 things here. Firstly, looking at this episode, it feels like it's missing so much in the details. It just feels like a hollow exercise. Engaging on the surface, but not when you get down to it, and that always annoys me and leaves me feeling frustrated. Secondly, it's just a prototype for the Moffat era and how he went on, and it bears so much frustrating resemblance to everything. And I know I shouldn't really be judging the episode on future episodes, but I don't know, when I sit down and watch Twice Upon a Time and realise nothing had really changed, it's difficult not to look back at this episode with a bit of frustration as a result. And thirdly, well, in the end it was just New Who intending to go on as it always does. But in the end I'll repeat myself no further with all that. I don't think this is a bad episode. I mean, if you want to find a bad New Who episode, there are no shortage of candidates. You don't need to call bad ones that aren't bad. It's just very frustrating because there's a good episode here somewhere, but it doesn't emerge. And, well, New Who and wasted potential. It does happen. All too frequently. I'm therefore giving this episode a final score of 5 out of 10. It's average, predictable New Who. It's got some good stuff in the new Doctor. Matt Smith is on top form. It's always engaging and entertaining, engaging and energetic, but it just doesn't emerge beyond that surface level, with a few rare exceptions such as the rooftop scene. It just lacks depth and development, and in the end, it just feels like a fairly generic adventure, and honestly that it never really had the ambition to go much beyond that. For me, it's emblematic of what went wrong with what came before and what came after, and New Who's biggest issue has always been its failure to learn from its mistakes and evolve, but oh well, there's always worse, as the Moffat era would conclusively prove many a time. So thank heaven for small mercies, eh? But yeah, anyway, this isn't a bad episode. It's just a frustrating one, and well, maybe if you have more patience for the Moffat era as a whole than I do, you'll enjoy this more. As I said, it's a popular episode among those who like New Who, so perhaps this is just my point of view coming out ahead.